The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Sergeant First Class Maya Thompson walked through the heavy oak doors. Her military dress uniform was pressed to perfection, each medal and ribbon positioned exactly where regulations required. But despite her composed exterior, her heart pounded against her ribcage like a trapped bird. Maya had served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Navy SEAL sniper, one of only a handful of women to ever earn the coveted Trident pin. Her record was spotless: 47 confirmed eliminations, 0 civilian casualties, and countless lives saved through her precise marksmanship. She had crawled through desert sand for miles, held her breath for minutes at a time while taking impossible shots, and earned the respect of every man in her unit. Now, she sat in a civilian courtroom facing charges that made her stomach turn. The prosecution claimed she had used excessive force during a domestic dispute call 6 months ago. A neighbor had called police about screaming next door. When Maya, who was visiting her sister in the area, heard the commotion and saw a man threatening a woman with a knife through the window, her training kicked in. She had tried to de-escalate the situation by identifying herself as military personnel and asking the man to put down the weapon. When he instead grabbed the woman and held the knife to her throat, Maya acted on pure instinct. Her years of combat experience told her the woman had seconds to live. She tackled the man, disarming him with techniques learned in the most elite military training in the world. The woman was safe. The man suffered a broken wrist and bruised ribs. But instead of gratitude, Maya found herself facing assault charges. The man's lawyer painted her as a dangerous vigilante who had used military combat training against a civilian. They claimed she could have simply called 911 and waited for police. Maya's attorney, James Morrison, was a former Marine himself who understood military culture. He had reviewed her service record extensively and believed strongly in her innocence. But he also knew that civilian juries sometimes viewed military personnel with suspicion, especially in cases involving physical force. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers. Maya noticed several people in the gallery wearing military insignia, fellow service members who had come to support her. Their presence gave her strength, reminding her that she was not alone in this fight. As the prosecutor began his opening statement, Maya forced herself to sit perfectly still and maintain eye contact. She had faced enemy fire without flinching. She would not show weakness now. The prosecutor painted a picture of an aggressive soldier who couldn't adapt to civilian life, who saw threats where none existed, and who used deadly force training in a situation that called for restraint. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, pacing in front of them like a predator circling prey, "the defendant may be a war hero, but that doesn't give her the right to take the law into her own hands." When Maya Thompson decided to physically assault Mr. Davidson, she crossed a line from protector to aggressor. Maya's jaw tightened as she listened to the twisted version of events. In the prosecutor's telling, she was a violence-seeking soldier who couldn't distinguish between a war zone and a suburban neighborhood. He made no mention of the knife, no acknowledgement of the woman's terror, no recognition that Maya had acted to save a life. Her attorney would get his chance to present the truth, but Maya knew that first impressions mattered enormously with juries. The prosecutor was skilled at his craft, weaving a narrative that made her sound dangerous and unstable. She caught several jurors nodding along with his arguments, and her heart sank a little deeper. When court recessed for lunch, Maya's sister Jennifer approached her with tears in her eyes. Jennifer had been the one to call Maya that terrible night, sobbing into the phone about what she had witnessed. She blamed herself for Maya's current situation, though Maya had told her 100 times that she had made the right choice. "I should testify," Jennifer whispered as they sat in Morrison's office, eating sandwiches that tasted like cardboard. "I should tell them exactly what I saw." Morrison shook his head. "We've discussed this. Your testimony would be helpful, but it's not worth the risk. The prosecution will tear you apart on cross-examination. They'll suggest you're biased because you're her sister, and they'll bring up your own struggles with anxiety to undermine your credibility." Maya reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. Jennifer had been through enough trauma in her life without being subjected to a hostile cross-examination. Maya would find another way to prove her innocence. As they returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, Maya noticed a commotion near the entrance. Several court officers were speaking urgently into their radios. and there seemed to be additional security personnel taking positions around the building. She wondered if there had been some kind of threat, but Morrison seemed unaware of any unusual activity. The afternoon proceeded with witness testimony that painted Maya in increasingly negative terms. The responding police officers testified that they found Davidson injured and Maya standing over him. Under the prosecutor's questioning, they made it sound like she had been the aggressor in a one-sided assault. Maya wanted to scream that they hadn't been there, that they hadn't seen Davidson holding a knife to an innocent woman's throat. They had arrived after the danger was over, after Maya had already neutralized the threat and ensured everyone's safety. But she had to trust that her attorney would bring out these crucial details during his cross-examination. As the day wore on, Maya felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Every glance from the jury box seemed to carry condemnation. Every whispered conversation in the gallery sounded like speculation about her guilt. She had faced enemy combatants who wanted to kill her, but somehow this felt more frightening than anything she had experienced in Afghanistan. The prosecutor's final witness of the day was Davidson himself, the man who had threatened his girlfriend with a knife. He took the stand wearing a neck brace and walking with a slight limp, playing up his injuries for the jury's benefit. His testimony painted Maya as an out-of-control soldier who had attacked him without provocation. "I was just having an argument with my girlfriend," he said, his voice quavering with what Maya recognized as false emotion. "Next thing I know, this woman comes crashing through the door like some kind of commando. She threw me to the ground and twisted my arm behind my back until I heard it snap." Maya's hands clenched into fists under the defense table. Every word was a lie. Every tear was manufactured for the jury's benefit. This man had been seconds away from killing his girlfriend, and now he was playing the victim in front of 12 people who would decide Maya's fate. As court adjourned for the day, Maya felt more discouraged than she had since the charges were first filed. The prosecution had built a compelling case against her, and she wasn't sure her attorney would be able to overcome the damage that had been done. She walked out of the courthouse into the fading daylight, wondering if tomorrow would bring vindication or the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The second day of trial began with an unexpected development. As Maya arrived at the courthouse, she noticed an unusual number of military personnel in the area. Some wore dress uniforms, others were in civilian clothes, but she could spot them easily after years of military service. There was something in their posture, their haircuts, their way of scanning their surroundings that marked them as fellow service members. Maya's attorney Morrison looked puzzled as they made their way through security. "Word must be getting out about your case," he said quietly. "I've never seen so many military people at a civilian trial." Inside the courtroom, the gallery was even more crowded than the previous day. Maya recognized some faces from her own unit, but many others were strangers. A group of women in military dress uniforms sat in the front row, their ribbons and medals catching the fluorescent lights. She realized they were other female service members, possibly some of the rare women who had broken barriers in special operations. The prosecutor seemed rattled by the increased attention. He had clearly expected this to be a routine case that would barely register in the local news. Instead, he was facing a courtroom full of people who understood military culture and training in ways that civilian juries typically did. Not Morrison had spent the previous evening preparing his cross-examination of Davidson, and Maya could see the determination in his eyes as court resumed. He had told her that winning this case would depend on exposing the lies in the prosecution's narrative and helping the jury understand what really happened that night. "Mr. Davidson," Morrison began, approaching the witness stand with confidence, "you testified yesterday that you were simply having an argument with your girlfriend. Is that accurate?" Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Yes, that's right. Just a normal disagreement between couples." Morrison walked over to the evidence table and picked up a large photograph. "Your Honor, I'd like to show the witness prosecution exhibit number 7, a photograph of the kitchen knife found at the scene. The knife in the photo was large and clearly sharp, the kind used for cutting meat." Morrison held it where the jury could see it clearly. "Mr. Davidson, can you explain why this knife was found on the floor next to where you were lying when police arrived?" "I don't know," Davidson mumbled. "Maybe it fell out of the dishwasher or something." "The dishwasher?" Morrison's voice carried just a hint of disbelief. "According to the police report, the dishwasher was closed and running at the time. How would a knife fall out of a closed running dishwasher? Davidson's face reddened. I don't remember exactly. It was a very traumatic experience. Morrison nodded sympathetically. I'm sure it was traumatic. Let me ask you about your girlfriend, Sarah Martinez. Where is she today? She's not here, Davidson said quickly. She didn't want to get involved in all this legal stuff. Actually, Mr. Davidson, isn't it true that Ms. Martinez obtained a restraining order against you the day after this incident? The prosecutor jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? Morrison turned to the judge. Your Honor, this goes directly to the defendant's state of mind and the reasonableness of her actions. If the jury is to understand why Sergeant Thompson acted as she did, they need to know what she witnessed. I'll allow it, the judge ruled. Please answer the question, Mr. Davidson. Davidson's lawyer whispered something in his ear during a brief pause. Yes, he finally admitted, Sarah got a restraining order, but that doesn't prove anything about what happened that night. Morrison continued his methodical destruction of Davidson's credibility. He produced hospital records showing that Davidson's injuries were consistent with being disarmed by someone with professional training, not with being randomly assaulted. He revealed Davidson's previous arrests for domestic violence, painting a picture of a man with a pattern of threatening behavior. Maya watched the jury's faces as the truth emerged. Several jurors who had seemed sympathetic to Davidson the previous day were now looking at him with suspicion. The narrative was shifting, but Maya knew they still had a long way to go. During the lunch break, Maya was approached by one of the women in military uniform from the front row. She was a tall African-American woman with the bearing of a senior officer. Sergeant Thompson, I'm Colonel Patricia Williams, Army Special Forces. I wanted you to know that there are a lot of people following your case. Maya was surprised by the attention from such a high-ranking officer. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the support. Colonel Williams leaned closer and spoke quietly. What you did that night was exactly what your training prepared you for. You saw a threat to an innocent person and you neutralized it with appropriate force. Don't let them make you doubt yourself. Other military personnel approached during the break, each offering words of encouragement. A Navy SEAL team leader told her that her actions reflected the best values of their community. A Marine Corps sergeant said she had shown exactly the kind of judgment and courage they tried to instill in all their people. The afternoon session brought more favorable developments for Maya's defense. Morrison called Sarah Martinez to testify via video link, since she was too afraid to appear in person. Through tears, she described the terror she had felt when Davidson grabbed the knife and held it to her throat. He was screaming that he was going to kill me, she said, her voice shaking even months later. I really thought I was going to die. Then this woman appeared and she was so calm and professional. She told him to put the knife down, and when he didn't, she moved so fast I could barely see what happened. She saved my life. Morrison asked Sarah to describe Davidson's behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident. She painted a picture of escalating threats and violence, of a man who had become increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. Her testimony directly contradicted Davidson's claims that this had been just a normal argument between couples. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Sarah was brutal. He tried to suggest that she was lying to protect Maya, that her fear was exaggerated, that Davidson had never really intended to hurt her. But Sarah held firm to her story, and Maya could see that her obvious terror was making an impact on the jury. As the day ended, Maya felt more hopeful than she had since the trial began. The truth was finally coming out, and the jury was beginning to see what had really happened that night. But she also knew that the prosecution would not give up easily, and there were still several days of trial ahead. Walking out of the courthouse, Maya was surprised to find a small crowd of supporters waiting for her. Some held signs reading, "Support. Our heroes and Maya Thompson saved a life." Local news crews were interviewing some of the military personnel who had attended the trial. One reporter approached Maya directly. "Sergeant Thompson, how do you feel about the support you're receiving from the military community?" Maya paused, thinking carefully about her words. "I'm grateful for the support, but I want people to understand that this isn't just about me. This is about whether we're going to support people who try to do the right thing, even when it's difficult. I saw someone in danger and I acted to protect them. That's what any person with training and capability should do." As she walked to her car, Maya reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few months. She had gone from being a respected special operations soldier to being a defendant in a criminal trial. But the support she was receiving reminded her that there were still people who understood the difference between right and wrong, between protecting the innocent and being a vigilante. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Maya felt stronger, knowing that she was not facing them alone. The military community was rallying around her, and the truth was finally starting to emerge in the courtroom. The third day of trial brought an unexpected twist that would change everything. As Maya and her attorney Morrison arrived at the courthouse, they immediately noticed something different. The usual crowd of supporters was there, but now they were joined by what appeared to be official military personnel in dress uniforms, who stood with an air of authority that commanded attention. Court security was also more visible than previous days. Additional officers were stationed at various points throughout the building, and Maya noticed they were checking identification more carefully than usual. When she asked Morrison about it, he seemed as puzzled as she was. "Something's happening," he said quietly as they made their way to the courtroom. "I've never seen security this tight for a local assault case." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The prosecution team appeared nervous, huddling together and speaking in urgent whispers. The prosecutor kept glancing toward the gallery, where several people in military dress uniforms sat with the rigid posture that marked them as senior officers. Maya took her place at the defense table, trying to focus on the day ahead rather than the unusual circumstances surrounding it. Morrison had prepared her for this session, which would feature expert testimony about military training and the use of force. These witnesses would be crucial in helping the jury understand that Maya's actions were not those of an out-of-control vigilante, but of a trained professional responding appropriately to a life-threatening situation. The first witness was Dr. Robert Chen, a former Army colonel who now worked as a consultant on military training and tactics. Dr. Chen had reviewed the case file extensively and was prepared to explain to the jury exactly what Maya would have been taught about threat assessment and force escalation. Morrison began his questioning by establishing Dr. Chen's credentials: 25 years in the Army, including service with special forces, followed by a decade of consulting work with law enforcement agencies on proper use of force protocols. "Dr. Chen," Morrison began, "based on your review of the evidence in this case, can you tell the jury whether Sergeant Thompson's actions were consistent with her military training?" Dr. Chen turned toward the jury with the confidence of someone who had testified in dozens of similar cases. "Absolutely. Sergeant Thompson did exactly what she was trained to do. She assessed the threat, attempted verbal de-escalation, and when that failed and the threat became imminent, she used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the danger." The prosecutor had been fidgeting throughout Dr. Chen's testimony, clearly uncomfortable with the direction it was taking. During cross-examination, he tried to suggest that military training was inappropriate for civilian situations, that Maya should have simply called 911 and waited for police to arrive. "Dr. Chen," the prosecutor said, "isn't it true that military personnel are trained to kill the enemy, not to protect civilians?" Dr. Chen's expression hardened. "That's a fundamental misunderstanding of military training, counselor. Every service member is trained first and foremost to protect innocent life. The rules of engagement in every theater of operation prioritize civilian safety above all else. But surely you'll agree that tackling someone and breaking their arm goes beyond reasonable force." Actually, no. Given that the suspect was armed with a lethal weapon and holding it to the victim's throat, Sergeant Thompson showed remarkable restraint. She could have used deadly force and been completely justified. Instead, she chose a non-lethal approach that saved the victim's life while minimizing injury to the perpetrator. Maya felt a surge of gratitude toward Dr. Chen. He was articulating what she had been unable to express herself, that her actions that night had been guided by years of training, designed to protect the innocent while minimizing harm to everyone involved. The next witness was even more impressive. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Rodriguez had served as an instructor at the Navy SEAL training facility and had personally trained dozens of women who had attempted to earn the coveted Trident pin. She spoke with authority about the rigorous selection process Maya had endured and the exceptional skills she had demonstrated. "The training Sergeant Thompson received is among the most comprehensive in the world," Master Chief Rodriguez explained. "SEAL snipers are taught not just marksmanship, but threat assessment, risk evaluation, and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. They learned to distinguish between legitimate threats and false alarms, to use appropriate levels of force, and to protect innocent life at all costs. Morrison asked her to explain Maya's service record to the jury. Rodriguez described Maya's 3 tours in Afghanistan, her 47 confirmed eliminations without a single civilian casualty, and the numerous commendations she had received for valor and professionalism. "In my 22 years of military service," Rodriguez said, looking directly at the jury, "I have never worked with a soldier who demonstrated better judgment under pressure than Sergeant Thompson." Her record speaks for itself. During the lunch break, Maya noticed unusual activity in the courthouse corridors. Several people in expensive suits were having intense conversations with court officials. She overheard fragments of discussions about protocol and security arrangements that seemed unrelated to her case. Morrison returned from a meeting with the prosecutor looking puzzled. "Something strange is going on," he told Maya as they sat in a conference room. "The prosecutor just asked if we'd be willing to accept a plea bargain for time served. When I asked why the sudden change of heart, he wouldn't give me a straight answer." Maya shook her head firmly. "I'm not pleading guilty to anything. I saved a woman's life and I won't apologize for that." Morrison smiled. "That's exactly what I told him. But I get the feeling there's something happening behind the scenes that we don't know about." The afternoon session brought Maya's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, to testify on her behalf. Colonel Webb had led Maya's unit during her most recent deployment and had personally observed her performance in combat situations. "Sergeant Thompson is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command," he told the jury. "Her judgment, skill, and dedication to protecting innocent life are exemplary. The actions she took that night are entirely consistent with the values and training we instill in our special operations personnel." The prosecutor's cross-examination of Colonel Webb was perfunctory at best. He seemed distracted, frequently glancing toward the gallery and checking his phone. Maya noticed that several members of the prosecution team had left the courtroom entirely, which struck her as highly unusual during active testimony. As Colonel Webb concluded his testimony, Maya felt more confident than she had at any point since the trial began. The evidence was clearly in her favor, and the jury seemed to be responding positively to the expert witnesses who had explained her training and background. But the biggest surprise of the day was yet to come. As court was preparing to adjourn for the day, the bailiff approached the judge with a message that caused him to pause and read carefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge announced, "I've just been informed that we'll need to extend today's session slightly to accommodate an additional witness. The court will take a 15-minute recess to prepare for this testimony." During the recess, Maya noticed increased activity from the court security officers. They seemed to be clearing certain areas of the courthouse and positioning themselves strategically throughout the building. She caught Morrison's eye and saw her own confusion reflected in his expression. When court reconvened, the bailiff made an announcement that sent a wave of surprise through the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Admiral James Mitchell, United States Navy." Maya's heart stopped. Admiral Mitchell was not just any flag officer. He was one of the most respected leaders in the Navy, a legend in the special operations community, and someone whose mere presence commanded attention from everyone in uniform. As the Admiral walked into the courtroom in his full-dress uniform, every military person in the gallery snapped to attention. His ribbons and medals told the story of a distinguished career spanning decades of service in the most dangerous corners of the world. Maya had never met Admiral Mitchell personally, but she knew his reputation. He was known for his fierce loyalty to his people, his intolerance for injustice, and his willingness to put his own career on the line to protect service members under his command. The prosecutor looked like he had seen a ghost. This was clearly not something he had been prepared for, and Maya could see him frantically whispering with his team about what this development might mean for their case. As Admiral Mitchell took his seat in the witness chair, Maya felt a surge of hope mixed with bewilderment. She had no idea why one of the Navy's most senior leaders had come to testify in her case, but his presence alone seemed to have shifted the entire atmosphere in the courtroom. The judge looked equally surprised by this turn of events, but he maintained his professional composure as Morrison approached the witness stand to begin his questioning. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Admiral James Mitchell settled into the witness chair. His presence commanded such respect that even the court reporter seemed to sit straighter. Maya stared at the Admiral in wonder, trying to understand how her case had drawn the attention of someone at his level of leadership. Morrison approached the witness stand with obvious respect, but also with the confidence of someone who knew this testimony would be crucial to his client's defense. "Admiral Mitchell," Morrison began, "would you please state your current position for the record?" "I am Admiral James Mitchell, Commander of Naval Special Warfare Command," the Admiral replied, his voice carrying the authority of decades of leadership. "I oversee all Navy SEAL operations worldwide and am responsible for the training, deployment, and welfare of approximately 2,800 active duty SEALs." Maya felt her breath catch. Naval Special Warfare Command was the highest level of SEAL leadership, and the Admiral was essentially the top boss of every Navy SEAL in the world, including her. "Admiral, are you familiar with Sergeant First Class Maya Thompson's service record?" "I am intimately familiar with it," Admiral Mitchell replied, turning slightly toward the jury. "Sergeant Thompson's record is exceptional by any standard. Her performance during 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan was exemplary, and her actions saved countless American and Allied lives." Morrison walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick folder. "Admiral, could you tell the jury about some of the specific commendations Sergeant Thompson has received?" Admiral Mitchell opened the folder and began reading from Maya's service record. "Sergeant Thompson has been awarded the Bronze Star Medal with Combat Vi for Valor, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, the Navy Commendation Medal with Combat Fee, and the Combat Action Ribbon, among others. She has also received 3 unit citations for exceptional performance under fire." The jury was listening with obvious attention. Several members were taking notes, and Maya could see that they were beginning to understand the level of service and sacrifice she had given to her country. "Admiral, in your expert opinion, based on Sergeant Thompson's training and experience, were her actions on the night in question appropriate and justified?" Admiral Mitchell straightened in his chair and looked directly at the jury. "Absolutely. Sergeant Thompson did exactly what she was trained to do. She assessed a life-threatening situation, attempted to de-escalate verbally, and when that failed, she used the minimum force necessary to save an innocent life." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness wasn't present at the scene and cannot testify to what actually happened." Morrison responded smoothly. "Your Honor, Admiral Mitchell is testifying as an expert witness about military training, and whether the defendant's actions were consistent with that training. He's not testifying about the specific facts of the incident." "Overruled," the judge said. "Continue, Admiral Mitchell." The Admiral nodded and continued. "What many civilians don't understand is that military training, especially SEAL training, is designed first and foremost to protect innocent life. We teach our people to use graduated force, to exhaust non-lethal options whenever possible, and to take personal risks to minimize harm to others." Morrison asked the Admiral to explain Maya's sniper training and how it related to decision-making under pressure. Admiral Mitchell described the rigorous mental training that snipers undergo, their need to make split-second life-or-death decisions, and their responsibility to distinguish between legitimate threats and innocent civilians. Sergeant Thompson's record shows 47 confirmed eliminations with 0 civilian casualties. Admiral Mitchell told the jury, "That level of precision and judgment doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of extraordinary training, discipline, and character." Maya felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to Admiral Mitchell describe her service. After months of being portrayed as a dangerous vigilante, it was overwhelming to hear one of the Navy's most senior leaders defending her actions and character. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Admiral Mitchell was painful to watch. He tried to suggest that military training was inappropriate for civilian situations, that Maya should have waited for police, that her actions were excessive. Admiral Mitchell methodically destroyed each argument with calm professionalism. "Counselor," Admiral Mitchell said at one point, "if someone was holding a knife to your wife's throat, would you want a trained professional to intervene immediately, or would you prefer that person to walk away and make a phone call while your wife died?" The prosecutor had no good answer to that question, and Maya could see several jurors nodding in agreement with the Admiral's point. But Admiral Mitchell wasn't finished. As his testimony continued, he began to reveal why he had come to testify in Maya's case, and his explanation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. "Your Honor, Admiral Mitchell said, turning toward the judge. I feel it's important for the court to understand that Sergeant Thompson's case has implications far beyond this courtroom. The military community is watching this trial very closely. Morrison asked the Admiral to elaborate on what he meant. Sergeant Thompson represents the best values of military service: courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the innocent, Admiral Mitchell explained. If we prosecute service members for acting on these values, we send a dangerous message to every person wearing our nation's uniform. The Admiral's voice grew more serious as he continued. I have received communications from senior military leaders across all branches of service expressing concern about this prosecution. We are deeply troubled by the suggestion that a service member who saves an innocent life should face criminal charges for doing so. Maya could see the prosecutor growing more uncomfortable by the minute. This was clearly not the direction he had expected the case to take when he filed the charges months earlier. Admiral Mitchell continued his testimony with a revelation that stunned everyone in the courtroom. I have also been in communication with the Department of Defense General Counsel's office regarding this case. They have expressed serious concerns about the precedent that would be set by convicting Sergeant Thompson. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Your Honor, I object to any discussion of political pressure being brought to bear on this case. Admiral Mitchell's expression hardened. Counselor, this is not about politics. This is about justice. And it's about ensuring that we don't punish people for doing the right thing. The judge sustained the objection, but Maya could see that the Admiral's message had been received loud and clear by the jury. The stakes of this case were much higher than anyone had realized. As Admiral Mitchell's testimony concluded, he did something that brought tears to Maya's eyes. He stood up from the witness chair, walked over to where she was sitting, and extended his hand. Sergeant Thompson, he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom, I want you to know that the entire Navy SEAL community is proud of you. Your actions that night represent the very best of what we try to instill in our people. Maya stood and shook the Admiral's hand, feeling the weight of his support and the support of the entire military community behind her. As he left the courtroom, every military person in the gallery stood at attention until he had passed. The prosecutor requested an immediate recess, and Maya could see him huddling with his team in obvious distress. The case that had once seemed routine was now clearly anything but ordinary. During the break, Morrison could barely contain his excitement. Maya, I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of practice. Having Admiral Mitchell testify on your behalf is like having the President himself vouch for your character. Maya nodded, still processing what had just happened. She had served her country faithfully for years, but she had never expected that her service would be recognized at such a high level when she needed it most. As court prepared to reconvene, Maya felt a sense of momentum that had been missing throughout the trial. The truth was finally emerging, and she had the support of people who understood what it meant to serve others before yourself. But she also knew that the prosecutor wouldn't give up easily, and there were still closing arguments to come. The next phase of the trial would determine whether the jury had been convinced by Admiral Mitchell's powerful testimony, or whether they would still view her as a vigilante who had taken the law into her own hands. The fourth day of trial began with an atmosphere unlike anything Maya had experienced since her ordeal started. Word of Admiral Mitchell's testimony had spread beyond the courthouse, and the media attention had intensified dramatically overnight. Local news crews had been joined by national reporters, and the courthouse steps were crowded with cameras and microphones. Maya arrived to find protesters on both sides of the issue. One group held signs supporting her with messages like, "Heroes don't deserve prosecution and Maya saved a life." The opposing group, much smaller but vocal, carried signs reading, "No one above the law" and "Military training not an excuse." Inside the courtroom, tensions were clearly running high. The prosecution team looked haggard, as if they had spent the night in emergency strategy sessions. The prosecutor himself seemed to have aged years since Admiral Mitchell's testimony the day before. Morrison, meanwhile, appeared confident and energized. He had spent the evening fielding calls from military leaders, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates who wanted to express support for Maya's case. The trial had evolved from a simple assault prosecution into a broader discussion about the rights and responsibilities of service members in civilian society. The first witness of the day was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and crisis intervention. Morrison had called her to explain to the jury how trained professionals like Maya respond differently to emergency situations than ordinary civilians. When someone with Sergeant Thompson's training witnesses a life-threatening situation, their response is instinctive and immediate, Dr. Walsh explained to the jury. Years of conditioning and practice take over. They don't have the luxury of standing back and analyzing the situation like someone watching a movie. They see a threat to innocent life and they act. Dr. Walsh described the psychological concept of moral injury, the trauma that occurs when trained protectors are prevented from helping those in need. She explained that prosecuting Maya for saving Sarah Martinez's life could cause lasting psychological damage, not just to Maya, but to other service members who might hesitate to help in future emergencies. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Dr. Walsh focused on trying to establish that Maya should have been able to override her training and follow civilian protocols. But Dr. Walsh held firm to her position that Maya's response was not only appropriate but psychologically inevitable given her background. You can't train someone for years to protect innocent life and then expect them to walk away when they see someone about to be murdered, Dr. Walsh said firmly. That would be asking them to violate everything they've been taught about duty and honor. The prosecutor tried a different approach. Dr. Walsh, isn't it possible that military personnel can become too aggressive, too quick to use force in situations that don't require it? Dr. Walsh shook her head. The evidence doesn't support that theory, counselor. Studies show that military personnel, especially those with combat experience, are actually more cautious about using force than civilian police officers. They understand the consequences of violence better than most people. The next witness was Sarah Martinez herself, appearing in person for the first time since the incident. Maya watched as the young woman walked nervously to the witness stand, still showing signs of the trauma she had endured. Sarah had been reluctant to testify in person, but Morrison had convinced her that the jury needed to hear directly from the person Maya had saved. Sarah's testimony was devastating to the prosecution's case. Speaking in a quiet but clear voice, she described the escalating violence in her relationship with Davidson and the terror she felt when he grabbed the knife that night. He had been drinking heavily, Sarah said, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. He started yelling about me talking to other men, which I wasn't doing. When I tried to leave, he grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen drawer. Morrison asked her to describe what happened next. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued her testimony. He grabbed me by the hair and put the knife to my throat. He was pressing it so hard that I could feel it cutting into my skin. He said he was going to kill me and then himself. I believed him completely. What happened when Sergeant Thompson arrived? She was like an angel, Sarah said, looking directly at Maya with gratitude. She stayed so calm even with him screaming and threatening. She kept talking to him, trying to get him to put the knife down. She never raised her voice or acted aggressive. But when he pressed the knife harder against my throat, she moved so fast I barely saw what happened. Morrison asked Sarah to describe Maya's demeanor after the incident. She immediately checked to make sure I was okay. She was gentle and professional, like a paramedic or something. She kept asking if I needed medical attention, if there was anyone she could call. She stayed with me until the police arrived and made sure I felt safe. The prosecutor's cross-examination of Sarah was brief and ineffective. He tried to suggest that she might be exaggerating the danger she was in, but her obvious sincerity and the medical record showing cuts on her neck from the knife blade made his arguments fall flat. During the lunch break, Maya was approached by a group of reporters asking for her reaction to the trial's developments. Morrison had advised her to avoid speaking to the media, but she felt compelled to address the growing attention her case was receiving. I want people to understand that this isn't about me, Maya said, speaking carefully and choosing her words with precision. This is about whether we're going to support people who try to protect others in danger. Sarah Martinez is alive today because I acted. That's all that matters to me. One reporter asked about Admiral Mitchell's testimony and what it meant to have such high-level military support. I'm honored by Admiral Mitchell's support and the support of the military community, Maya replied. But I would have done the same thing whether I was a SEAL or a civilian. When you see someone about to be killed, you act. That's just basic human decency. The afternoon session brought the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses, but their testimony seemed weak compared to the powerful defense case Morrison had presented. The prosecutor called a use-of-force expert who tried to argue that Maya should have used verbal de-escalation for longer before acting physically. But under cross-examination, the expert admitted he had never faced a situation where someone was holding a knife to an innocent person's throat. As the day progressed, Maya could sense that momentum was strongly in her favor. The jury members were paying close attention to every word, and several had been taking extensive notes throughout the proceedings. More importantly, she could see in their faces that they were beginning to understand the impossible position she had been placed in that night. The final witness of the day was Detective Maria Santos, one of the responding officers who had initially arrested Maya. Morrison's decision to call her as a defense witness surprised many people in the courtroom, but Maya trusted his strategy. "Detective Santos," Morrison began, "you were one of the first officers to arrive at the scene that night. Can you describe what you observed?" Detective Santos consulted her notes from the incident report. "When we arrived, we found the suspect, Mr. Davidson, on the floor with obvious injuries to his arm and ribs. The defendant, Sergeant Thompson, was sitting with the victim, Ms. Martinez, trying to comfort her. Did Sergeant Thompson resist arrest or attempt to flee the scene?" "No, sir. She was completely cooperative. She immediately identified herself as military personnel and explained what had happened. She even helped us collect evidence, including the knife that had been used to threaten Ms. Martinez." Morrison asked Detective Santos about Maya's demeanor during the arrest and questioning. "She was professional and respectful throughout the entire process. She answered all our questions honestly and expressed concern for Ms. Martinez's welfare. In my 15 years as a police officer, I've never arrested someone who was more cooperative or showed less signs of being out of control." The prosecutor tried to use Detective Santos's testimony to emphasize that Maya had injured Davidson, but the detective's responses only reinforced the defense narrative that Maya had acted appropriately under the circumstances. As court adjourned for the day, Maya felt cautiously optimistic about her chances. The evidence was clearly in her favor, and she had received support from quarters she never could have imagined. But she also knew that jury deliberations could be unpredictable, and she tried to prepare herself mentally for any outcome. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters had grown even larger. Military personnel from all branches of service had come to show their solidarity, and Maya was moved by their presence. Many approached her to express their support and share their own stories of difficult decisions they had faced in service to their country. As Maya drove home that evening, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that night 6 months ago, when she had acted to save Sarah Martinez. She had never imagined that doing what she believed was right would lead to a criminal trial that had captured national attention. But she also knew that she would make the same choice again without hesitation. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, and then the case would be in the hands of 12 jurors who would decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. Maya tried not to. The final day of testimony arrived with an intensity that Maya had never experienced in any combat situation. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks, and the crowd of supporters had grown so large that additional police barriers had been erected to manage the crowd. National news networks were providing live coverage of what had become known as the SEAL trial. Maya arrived early, needing time to compose herself before the most important day of her legal battle. As she sat in the conference room with Morrison, she noticed that her usually confident attorney seemed nervous for the first time since the trial began. "Maya," Morrison said, looking at his notes one final time, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens today, you've conducted yourself with incredible dignity throughout this entire process. You should be proud of that." Maya nodded, but her mind was focused on what lay ahead. Today would bring closing arguments from both sides, and then the case would go to the jury for deliberation. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed in service to her country, would be decided by 12 people who had never experienced the split-second decisions that defined military service. As they entered the courtroom, Maya was struck by the solemn atmosphere. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and in the aisles. She recognized faces from her military unit, fellow veterans she had never met, legal experts and journalists. But what moved her most was seeing Sarah Martinez sitting in the front row, having made the difficult decision to be present for the conclusion of the trial, the prosecutor began his closing argument. With a last desperate attempt to portray Maya as a vigilante who had taken the law into her own hands, he paced in front of the jury, his voice carrying a note of urgency that betrayed his awareness that his case was slipping away. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow sympathy for the defendant's military service to cloud our judgment about her actions that night, he began. Maya Thompson made a choice to use deadly force training against a civilian, and someone was seriously injured as a result. The prosecutor tried to minimize the threat that Davidson had posed to Sarah Martinez, suggesting that the situation could have been resolved without violence if Maya had simply called 911 and waited for police to arrive. The defendant wants you to believe that she was acting heroically, he continued. But heroes don't break people's arms. Heroes don't take the law into their own hands. Heroes work within the system even when it's difficult or time-consuming. Maya forced herself to remain composed as she listened to this distorted version of events. The prosecutor was asking the jury to ignore everything they had heard about Davidson's violent history, about the knife pressed to Sarah's throat, about Maya's attempts at verbal de-escalation. He was asking them to live in a fantasy world where dangerous situations could always be resolved through patience and proper procedure. The prosecutor concluded his argument by appealing to the jury's sense of law and order. If you acquit Maya Thompson, you're sending a message that military training gives people the right to bypass civilian law enforcement. You're saying that anyone with combat experience can decide for themselves when violence is justified. Morrison's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal advocacy that would be remembered long after the trial ended. He began by addressing the prosecutor's arguments directly, systematically dismantling each false narrative that had been presented. The prosecutor wants you to believe that Maya Thompson should have stood by and watched an innocent woman die, Morrison said, his voice filled with controlled indignation. He wants you to believe that following proper procedure is more important than saving a human life. Morrison walked over to where Sarah Martinez was sitting and gestured toward her respectfully. Ladies and gentlemen, that woman is alive today because Maya Thompson acted with courage and precision when it mattered most. The prosecutor would prefer that she be dead, as long as the proper forms were filled out afterward. The defense attorney reminded the jury of all the evidence they had heard. Davidson's history of violence, the knife wounds on Sarah's neck, the expert testimony about Maya's training and judgment. He painted a picture of a decorated veteran who had acted exactly as she had been trained to act in service to her country. Maya Thompson spent years in Afghanistan, risking her life to protect innocent people from terrorists and criminals, Morrison continued. She came home to civilian life, but she never stopped being someone who puts the welfare of others above her own safety. Morrison's voice grew stronger as he continued. The prosecution wants you to believe that there's something wrong with that instinct. They want you to believe that training people to protect the innocent is somehow dangerous to society. But I submit to you that Maya Thompson represents the very best of what we hope to find in our fellow citizens, the attorney reminded the jury of Admiral Mitchell's testimony and the support Maya had received from the military community. This case has drawn attention from the highest levels of military leadership because they understand what's at stake here. If we prosecute people for saving innocent lives, we undermine the very values that make our society worth defending. Morrison concluded his argument with a direct appeal to the jury's sense of justice. Maya Thompson saved Sarah Martinez's life. She did it at considerable personal risk with no thought of reward or recognition. She acted out of duty, honor, and basic human decency. If those actions constitute a crime in our society, then we have lost our way as a people. As Morrison returned to the defense table, Maya felt a surge of gratitude for his passionate advocacy. He had articulated everything she had wanted to say throughout the trial, and she could see that his words had made an impact on several jury members. The judge's instructions to the jury were lengthy and complex, covering the legal standards for self-defense, defense of others, and the use of reasonable force. Maya tried to follow along, but her mind kept drifting to thoughts of what would happen if the jury found her guilty. Would she go to prison? Would her military career be over? Would other service members hesitate to help people in danger because of her prosecution? As the jury filed out to begin deliberations, Maya felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had done everything she could to present her case, and now her fate was in the hands of 12 strangers who would have to decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. The waiting began immediately. Morrison had warned her that jury deliberations could take anywhere from a few hours to several days, depending on how much discussion the jurors felt they needed. Maya and her supporters settled in for what could be a long and agonizing wait. During the first few hours, Maya tried to stay busy by reviewing case documents and discussing strategy with Morrison. But as the afternoon wore on, the waiting became more difficult. Every time the courtroom door opened, her heart jumped, thinking the jury might be returning with a verdict. Morrison tried to keep her spirits up by pointing out positive signs from the deliberations. "The fact that they're taking their time is actually good news," he explained. "If they were going to convict you, they probably would have done it quickly. The longer they deliberate, the more likely it is that they're seriously considering acquittal." As evening approached, the judge dismissed the jury for the day, instructing them to return the following morning to continue their deliberations. Maya would have to spend another sleepless night wondering about her future, but she also knew that the extra time might work in her favor. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters had maintained their vigil throughout the day. As Maya emerged, they erupted in cheers and chants of support. She was moved by their loyalty, but also anxious about the message their presence might send to the jury. That night, Maya lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought about her years of military service, the lives she had saved and the sacrifices she had made. She thought about Sarah Martinez and the terror in her eyes when Davidson held that knife to her throat. Most of all, she thought about whether she would make the same choice again if faced with the same situation. The answer was clear. She would do exactly the same thing, regardless of the personal consequences. Some things were more important than following procedure, and protecting innocent life was at the top of that list. Maya barely slept that night, and she arrived at the courthouse the next morning feeling exhausted, but strangely peaceful. The crowd of supporters had grown even larger overnight, and she noticed that several prominent military leaders had joined the vigil. The sight of so many people who believed in her gave her strength for whatever was to come. Inside the courthouse, the waiting continued. Morrison paced nervously while Maya sat quietly, trying to maintain the composure that had carried her through years of combat and months of legal proceedings. Every hour that passed without a verdict felt like a lifetime. At 11:30 a.m., the bailiff entered the courtroom with news that sent Maya's heart racing. The jury had reached a verdict. Word spread quickly through the courthouse, and within minutes the courtroom was packed to capacity with spectators, media representatives, and Maya's supporters. As Maya took her place at the defense table, she noticed her hands were trembling slightly. Morrison placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Whatever happens, you've conducted yourself with honor throughout this entire process." The judge entered and called the court to order. The noise in the courtroom faded to complete silence as everyone waited for the moment that would determine Maya's future. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man who had served in the army during the Gulf War, stood up. "Yes, Your Honor, we have. Please hand the verdict to the bailiff." Maya watched as the folded paper that contained her fate was passed from the foreman to the bailiff to the judge. The judge read it silently, his expression revealing nothing about its contents. "Will the defendant please rise?" Maya stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Morrison stood beside her, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom focused on her. "Members of the jury, how do you find?" The foreman looked directly at Maya as he spoke. "In the matter of the state versus Maya Thompson, on the charge of assault in the second degree, we find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause that the judge made no attempt to suppress. Maya felt her knees give way, and she had to grab the defense table to keep from falling. Morrison wrapped her in a bear hug while tears streamed down both their faces, but the jury foreman wasn't finished. He remained standing, clearly wanting to say something more. The judge, recognizing this unusual situation, allowed him to continue. "Your Honor, if I may, the jury would like to make a statement." The judge nodded, and the courtroom fell quiet again. "We want it to be clear that our verdict is not just not guilty. We believe that Sergeant Thompson is a hero who saved an innocent woman's life. We believe that prosecuting her for these actions was wrong, and we hope that this verdict sends a clear message that we will not punish people for doing the right thing." The applause that followed was thunderous and sustained. Maya saw Admiral Mitchell in the gallery, standing and applauding with tears in his eyes. Sarah Martinez was crying and mouthing thank you to Maya from across the courtroom. As the celebration continued around her, Maya felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also vindication and hope. The jury hadn't just found her innocent. They had validated her actions and sent a message that would be heard throughout the military, community, and beyond. The judge finally restored order and formally dismissed the jury with thanks for their service. As the courtroom began to empty, Maya was surrounded by well-wishers, supporters, and media representatives all wanting to hear her reaction to the verdict. Morrison guided her to a microphone that had been set up outside the courthouse, where hundreds of people had gathered to await news of the verdict. The crowd fell silent as Maya prepared to speak publicly about her ordeal for the first time. "First," Maya began, her voice steady despite her emotions, "I want to thank the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence and for understanding that sometimes doing the right thing requires difficult choices." She paused, looking out at the sea of supportive faces before continuing. "This case was never about me. It was about whether we're going to support people who try to protect others in danger. The jury's verdict sends a clear message that we will not punish heroism." A reporter called out, asking what Maya planned to do next. She smiled for the first time in months. "I plan to continue serving my country and my community in whatever way I can, and if I ever again witness someone threatening an innocent person, I will act to protect them, just as I did that night." The crowd's cheers were so loud that Maya had to wait several minutes before she could continue speaking. When the noise finally died down, she addressed the military personnel in the audience. "To my fellow service members who are watching this, I want you to know that your training and your values matter. Don't let anyone tell you that protecting innocent life is wrong. Don't let anyone tell you that your oath to defend others ends when you take off your uniform." Admiral Mitchell approached the microphone, and Maya stepped aside respectfully. His presence commanded immediate attention from the crowd and the media. "I want to make something very clear," Admiral Mitchell said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and experience. "Sergeant Thompson's actions that night exemplify everything we try to instill in our service members. She saw an innocent person in mortal danger and she acted to protect them. That is exactly what we train our people to do." The Admiral continued, "The military community will remember this case for a long time. We will remember that when one of our own was prosecuted for doing the right thing, the American people stood with her. We will remember that justice prevailed, and that heroism was recognized rather than punished." As the Admiral finished speaking, Maya noticed something that brought tears to her eyes. Sarah Martinez had made her way through the crowd and was approaching the microphone. Maya stepped aside to let the woman she had saved address the gathering. "I don't know what to say," Sarah began, her voice shaking with emotion. "Maya Thompson saved my life. If she hadn't acted when she did, I would be dead right now. Instead of prosecuting her, we should be giving her a medal." Sarah turned to face Maya directly. "I will never forget what you did for me. You risked everything to save a complete stranger, and you've paid a terrible price for that heroism. I'm sorry you had to go through this, but I'm grateful that there are still people like you in the world." As the crowd began to disperse, Maya was approached by dozens of people wanting to shake her hand, thank her for her service, or simply express their support. Many were military personnel, but others were ordinary citizens who had been inspired by her story. Later that evening, Maya sat in her apartment reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a decorated soldier facing criminal prosecution for saving someone's life. Now she was free, vindicated, and surrounded by more support than she had ever imagined possible. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and messages of congratulations from military leaders around the world. But the call that meant the most came from her former commander in Afghanistan, who had heard about the verdict and wanted to express his pride in her courage and character. "Maya," he said, "you've shown the same courage in that courtroom that you showed in combat. You never backed down, never compromised your principles, and never stopped believing in doing the right thing. That's why you're a SEAL." As Maya hung up the phone and prepared for bed, she thought about what the future might hold. She knew that her military career would continue, and that she would keep serving her country with the same dedication she had always shown. But she also knew that her life had been changed forever by this experience. The trial had become about much more than her individual case. It had become a statement about the values that society chooses to support, about whether we reward heroism or punish it, about whether we stand behind people who risk themselves for others. The jury's verdict had answered those questions clearly, and Maya felt honored to have played a role in that important conversation. As she drifted off to sleep for the first peaceful night in months, she smiled knowing that somewhere out there, other service members would be more confident about acting to protect innocent life because of what had happened in that courtroom. The case of Maya Thompson had ended, but its impact on military culture, civilian-military relations, and the broader discussion about heroism and justice would continue for years to come, and Maya was proud to know that when it mattered most, she had stood up for what was right regardless of the personal cost.